Show your support for the Untold Radio Network family of shows and join in on the conversation by using super stickers and super chats on YouTube. Got a question you want answered? Ask it live via a super chat and get real-time responses from our show's knowledgeable hosts and guests. Help keep the Untold Radio Network shows running strong. We need your support. Send your super chats and stickers now.
Well, greetings, everybody. Welcome to Mysterious Library. Tonight, we're going to be looking at just an absolutely fascinating article, which I'm so glad I found. It's called How to Hack the Simulation by a computer science and engineer called by the name of Roman V. Yampolskiy. If, like me, you've ever wondered if you're actually living in base reality, or maybe you're just living in some kind of metaphysical dream, or perhaps you're a brain in a vat, or maybe you're trapped in a matrix style simulation, then this is the show for you, because Jason and I are about to dissect all of that and more on tonight's episode of Mysterious Library.
Greetings and salutations, simulations. It's going to be an interesting show.
Yeah, I'm so cursed by technology this last week. I wonder if the technology is insufficient for me to be living in a simulation. You would hope that they would have a bit of work out. Mind you, that would be part of the trickery as well, I imagine.
Right. So maybe the problem is you actually started to find base code reality, and they had to intervene.
Yeah, it's been all kinds of tech weirdness. I wasn't on Talking Weird this Saturday because my internet was so damn crummy. It was incapable of streaming. And thank you for stepping in with Donnie Chow and doing that. That was a great show. I could watch it kind of. My net was coming and going. There's no way I could have streamed, but you guys did a great job. And thank you, Donnie, who just dropped into the chat to say howdy. You did a great job on Talking Weird. It was a fascinating show.
I enjoyed it. It was a great time.
Yeah, people should go back and listen to it. It was very interesting. And of course, I'm super interested to be talking about what we're talking about tonight, because it's one of my favorite topics. And this article really is just spectacular. If people want to read it, they can go and download it from the show notes. Like, there's a link to where it sits on the internet to download. And if you've ever pondered this type of stuff, you've probably thought about much that's in there anyway. But what's fascinating about the article is that it proposes all of these ways that potentially, if we were living in a simulation, that we might be able to use to kind of to hack it, to get out.
Yeah, it's because we have one little thing we have to cover first, but I will say this. I think it's going to be an interesting conversation because I think you and I had very different opinions of the article.
I suspect we'll clash a little. I'm more sympathetic. It's the Gnostic Christianity in me that makes me more sympathetic to some of these ideas of that our reality isn't as real as it seems. And so all those blended thought strains from Neoplatonism through PK Dick have always impacted my thinking. It's
Yep.
true.
I know.
If I wasn't a Christian, which I am, if I wasn't, I would be
Mhm.
some kind of Neoplatonist Gnostic, and I would be even more sympathetic to the idea that we're in a simulation than I am. And I'm pretty sympathetic to the idea, by
Yeah.
the way. I certainly love the idea of playing with it anyway.
Yeah, I think where I would. All right, I'm going to say this. I'm actually not unsympathetic, and again, as I've said on this channel and several others before, I think that simulation theory is perhaps a great metaphor for reality, but I've got some serious problems with this paper. But before we go through that, we do need to point out that Sasquatch: The Legend Meets Science 2, the Kickstarter has launched for it. Meaning, if you ever saw The Legend Meets Science, the sequel is on its way. The Kickstarter is now live, and if we were smarter people, we would have downloaded the video to show you the commercial now, and we would have put in our description the link to go visit the Kickstarter to see it. But we are not smarter people, so we will have that ready for you next week. But if you're on Facebook, you can go to either of our channels after the show, and I'm certain we'll have the links up. But Doug Hygic on his channel has it. I know we've got it on Untold Radio AM. That's all there as well. It's going to be interesting. I've already talked to Doug about some things that they're working on this. Guys, it's going to be interesting when this thing gets made. There is stuff out there that y'all haven't seen that's being experimented on right now. It's being worked with right now. It's really amazing.
And there's nobody, frankly, in the documentary space who looks at cryptozoology or Bigfoot who has ever done anything approaching Doug Hyjek's work.
Nothing at all. I mean, this is honestly, The Legend Meets Science is your baseline for why should we even think that there is a creature walking around, right? Again, I'm of the opinion that I think the problem is we have more than one phenomena occurring, one that is supernatural and it's being mistaken for it. However, the reason I can't just say, like Dean is more privy to, right? Dean's, you're more of the, it's all supernatural or metaphysical, however you want to say it.
Or it's all a glitch in the, or as far as the show goes, it's a glitch in the matrix. And that's a kind of a very trite way of saying what I've often suspected as well, is that these things might be evidence. The fact that we never end up having any really convincing, at least for me, proof. There's never a body of a Sasquatch. There's never an ashtray from a down saucer. There's never, a body of a Loch Ness monster washed up on the shore. All of this stuff always seems to come into our reality, physically impact it, and then leave our reality again. And that might very well be how something that was interjected by, whether it was a divine being or a programmer or an evil demon, how something like that might come and go from a reality that we exist in that isn't the base reality.
The reason I can't go all the way, I can't go full Dean. Sorry, he's over here. I can't go full Dean on that is because of things like The Legend Meets Science, where you actually break down the physical evidence we have. Guys, there's more physical evidence, and there's experiments, there's DNA analysis and some chemical analyses that are going to be run for this thing, for this particular documentary. So we do highly recommend go and look at the Kickstarter. If you want to help out, you can. There are some really interesting looking rewards for it. So again, next week we'll have the link for that, and as well as the actual commercial. But again, after this is over, go visit Facebook, visit one of our pages or Doug Hyjek, and you'll find the link to the Kickstarter so you can see what's going on. Again, guys, this is something you should be excited for. If you are if you're a fan of Bigfoot, if you're a researcher, you're sympathetic to it, go take a look at this. This is going to be big.
And you can donate at all kinds of different levels. I think it goes
Yes.
from like $10 for a mention in the credits or something like that, a low price anyway, which is a great reward unto itself to be mentioned in a Doug Highcheck production, all the way through to like some fantastic advanced special bike and going biking with Doug Highcheck. Like whatever your spend is, if you're interested in this type of stuff, go and spend $10 if that's all you can afford. If you're more into it and if you've got some more money to spare, then look at some of the higher level perks because there's something there for everybody.
Yeah, and honestly, the amount that they're raising to do this is very low, all things considered. For a documentary like this, the price point they're trying to reach, I've seen comic books go 40, 50 grand above what they're asking to do what is going to end up being perhaps the most important documentary in the Fortean field in a long time, if not just of all time. So again, go give it a look after this. Okay, I'm going to let Dean begin because I think I'll let Dean describe what is being what the overall discussion is, and then we'll get into our thoughts on the actual thing because it's gonna be a hoedown.
I think a good way of starting on this topic, because it is an academic level paper, it's worth reading the abstract so people have a sense of what's to come, because that's what anybody does who picks up something like this. Usually you read the abstract and then you read the piece. So the abstract says, many researchers have conjectured that the humankind is simulated along with the rest of the physical universe, a simulation hypothesis. In this paper, we do not evaluate evidence for or against such claim, but instead ask a computer science question, namely, can we hack the simulation? More formally, the question could be phrased as, could generally intelligent agents placed in virtual environments find a way to jailbreak out of them? Given that the state-of-the-art literature on AI containment answers in the affirmative, AI is uncontainable in the long term, is what's popularly thought, that eventually AI is going to bust out. We conclude that it should be possible to escape from the simulation, at least with the help of superintelligent AI. By contraposition, if escape from the simulation is not possible, containment of AI should be an important theoretical result for AI safety research. Finally, the paper surveys and proposes ideas for hacking the simulation and analyzes ethical and philosophical issues of such an undertaking. So there is an awful lot in this article, and there's an awful lot that we'll unpack, and I'm sure we're going to go into more esoteric and directions than even the article suggests, but that's a great starting off point, I think.
No, it is. Speaking of breaking the simulation, Nancy, I saw your comment. While Dean was reading, I hopped on, and it looks like YouTube's working for me, so it may be something to do with your connection as far as YouTube is concerned. But again, guys, if something happens on YouTube, you can always hop on over to the Facebook page and watch it there.
That's true.
Let me start with I like the base idea of how do we, he flat out says we're not even going to address whether or not this is, or the evidence for or against this being a simulation, right? And I think it's like, okay, that's fair because he wants to get to another position. Although that's sort of my first problem is you don't even actually know that this is a simulation, right? That's sort of my initial problem is, hey, the entirety of this paper is predicated on something that you can't actually prove, and is sort of based on, and I think my core problem is that there's a lot of assumptions about this particular that all of this is based on, not just whether or not this is a simulation, but and to his credit, he does address this later on with the idea of AI boxing as sort of a template. But a lot of the things that a lot of the techniques that are discussed for trying to hack the simulation are predicated on the idea that there is that even if we assume that this is a simulation, that we could do something that would cause so much memory to be used that it would create lags or glitches, delays. And the problem is that assumes that, again, even if you start with the idea that it's that it is a simulation. That assumes that the resources aren't infinite, at least as far as we could even begin to measure them. It's working from the assumption that we could tax the system hard enough to cause some sort of noticeable delay or anomaly. Oh, you're still muted, Dean.
Oh, I must have been muted and then unmuted because I clicked it. It's worth noting also, of course, that is one of the suggestions or one of the theories which is put forward, is that if we are in some type of computer simulation, then we could possibly overtax, as you were saying, the resources of said system by giving it more than it could simulate with its power, which would crash the system, like sending lots of advanced satellites into space. So it had to generate, far distances of the universe or whatever. And there's lots of suggestions like that in there. Of course, there's other ideas as well. There's the idea of how do you start communicating with whatever the simulators may be? How do you get a message to them? Because that's assuming that they're even watching. So that's another suggestion, is you try to align yourself with the simulator, or somehow you can perhaps get a kind of an anti-abolitionist on the other side of base reality, the same way that people might want to save animals from factory farms, or people might have wanted to free the slaves once upon a time, that you might be able to somehow get a message through that is enough to let them know there are sentient beings kind of suffering, and then there'll be a movement to free people who are trapped with, or free intelligences which are trapped in the AI. I mean, that's another suggestion. There's a number of kind of suggestions like that. There's a number of ways of, if we're in a simulation, how do we actually confront the problem and how do we move forward? I think you're right. I don't think anybody can say that there's evidence that we're in a simulation, but I think, again, what the author is suggesting, and what he says, actually, so I don't have to say that I think it, he says that there's so many people, and he lists them, people like Elon Musk and yada yada yada, multiple scientists, people who are actually high-end hackers, like what's the name of the guy who hacked the iPhone and he hacked Nintendo and he hacked a bunch of other stuff, who's come forward and said there's no doubt we're in a simulation, and I think I know how we might be able to hack and get it. So all various people have suggested it, who seem to know a lot more than I do about computer type technology. That doesn't mean they're smarter than me, but they're playing around with these ideas that this might be simulation. So the author's point is, I don't know if we're living in a simulation, but if all of this energy is being put forward by thinkers that we might be living in a simulation, then surely some energy should also be being put forward to ask the question, if these thinkers are right. And he lists, he's like, Elon Musk is 99% sure, Neil deGrasse Tyson is like 50% sure. Like he goes through and lists the kind of the probabilities various high-end thinkers give that we're in a simulation. He says, well, if all of these people who are relatively respected thinkers are putting this much emphasis on the fact that we could very well be in a simulation, then shouldn't we be channeling some energy into, if we're in a simulation, how do we actually respond? And some of the suggestions are, it might be dangerous going forward. Like it could be an existential threat to us to crash the system. That could be the end of it.
Right. I like that he at least addressed that point, because I'm over here thinking, okay, let's give you that premise that we are in a simulation, and that the simulation is being run on a system that has finite resources, and that we are able to tax those resources. It seems like a really bad idea to crash the system, because that means we go away like real fast. I'm sitting here thinking, like, I'm glad that you're addressing the moral implications of, just wiping all of us off out of the universe just for funsies, right?
And of course, a counter argument which he puts forward as well is, but then it's an end to the suffering of this planet or this universe that we're living in, this fake simulation. So there's two ways of looking at it. Like, you destroy the simulation we're living in, but then there's no more suffering.
Well,
so
okay, great.
You can see the argument of,
we could do that easier. We just nuke everything. Like it's a very nihilistic viewpoint.
I was about to say it's a nihilistic point, but there are lots of nihilistic thinkers as well. So I understand the reasoning. I'm not saying I agree with any of this.
Oh,
but
no,
I understand the reasoning behind a lot of it. I think it's nice too. Like he does put forward And this is where a lot of this science does become science fiction-y, is he puts forward a number of passages from fiction which is kind of imagined intelligences escaping out of
Right.
these kind of black iron prisons, as Philip K. Dick would have called them.
Yes.
And it's interesting. I don't think P.K. Dick's mentioned in there, interestingly, but he's
not.
probably the most significant science fiction author who's proposed that we might not be
Yes.
living. He didn't use the term base reality, but that this reality
Mhm.
might be some type of trap, that this isn't the ultimate spiritual reality. And Dick's writing, of course, is tainted when you get into Valis and Radio Free Albemuth and those kind of books. It's tainted
Mhm.
far more with an older religious esotericism than it really is with any science fiction trappings. While this,
Yes.
even though it's presented as a scientific paper, in some ways leans far more to your nuts and bolts hardwire science fiction type of
Mhm.
matrix type imaginary
Right.
prison that we might be trapped in, rather than a spiritual weird
Mhm.
trap that Philip K. Dick imagined.
Yeah. If you've ever read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, the basis for Blade Runner, that book gets weird fast, like real quick. There's, like I said, I actually prefer I prefer the film, the original version with the narration, not the new versions. But yeah, I do like that he's like, hey, do we even want to necessarily escape? It may be that base reality is worse than this one. Or we could just be brains in a jar. Or I do like the idea that he says, hey, perhaps the real issue here is that our universe is designed to hold malevolent intelligences or rehabilitate them, so that the security system may be far more than we could ever want or to even imagine breaking, because it would be designed to be prevented, to prevent a jailbreak of that kind of thing. They said, but if it's not, if it's a research thing, or if it's this other thing, then maybe that kind of security is lacking and we can hack it. There's just so much assumption on this. I know he's just saying, look, this is the first paper of its kind. We're just trying to throw these ideas out here. I think that's what rubbed me the wrong way the most, was just, it was just assumption on top of assumption on top of assumption. And there were some comments I found almost insultingly bad, in as far as when he's referring to, it's like, well, we won't even really, it's like, yes, some religions have referred to this as not real or whatever. And he goes, but we're not really going to entertain those because we can't seem to again communicate with the outside world in any appreciable response. It's like, hold on, you are literally dismissing thousands of years of these religious thinkers who are saying, yes, we are in communication with these things, with things that are outside the base code of material existence. We are talking to these things. These things have spoken to us. We've encountered them. You're taking all of that and just saying we're moving it off the table, and we're going to look for these other things that you may not have. If you really read what he's saying, it's like, we may not have any contact with this base code. If you just work from the idea that it is a simulation, and we're just programs running within that simulation, well, then you got the first problem of, can you even access the base code of this reality? And you don't even know that that's the thing that you can even bother to interact with. So why are we removing, to your point, because it's focusing so much on this nuts and bolts, like, well, why are you then removing the context of thousands of years of human mystical and religious experience? Because they're kind of doing exactly what let me read right here. I had this part pulled up. We're talking about the social engineering as a way of escaping. For those of you who are unaware, social engineering is a form of hacking where you communicate with another person and you get them to give you access as the hacker to their system, right? This is most something very recent. I know some people who they called them, said, hey, we're from your bank. We think this amount has been taken from you. We need you to do XYZ. Now, here's the thing. They were really good about showing that they were from the said bank, and the requests they were making doesn't make any sense as to how it could allow. It was like, you need to send yourself $500, and then that will allow us to refund the money. Well, that allowed them to intercept and then steal that money from them. That's social engineering. So this is how this one section that I think is sort of interesting. It says, step 1, convince the simulators to engage in communications with us. Find a way to communicate, perhaps via an avatar. Find a reason for simulators to want us to join them in the real world. Step 4, let the simulators figure out the best way to get us into the real world. Wei Dai suggests the simulators may help us escape for instrumental reasons, such as wanting someone to talk to or play with. Some useful knowledge about escaping, and especially escaping via social engineering attacks, may be learned from extensive literature on prison escapes. The thing I found the most interesting about this whole little section here is that's, again, you could take the computer language out of it. And this is every occultist I've ever talked to. So that was my number one problem is that he wipes away essentially the people who are doing this and says, well, we don't have any appreciable evidence that that's worked. Okay, but it's only because you took that off the playing field. You don't see the evidence because you took it off the board, and you're not considering it to begin with. So this is a big problem because you're dismissing your own point.
Part of it might also be because it's financed, as he says at the end of the article, by Elon Musk partly, and one of Musk's institutions, or at least an institution that Musk is involved with, the Future of Life Institute. And Musk is one of those people that, at least for me, half of the time I really like everything he says, and half of the time I just think it's madness. But Musk's positions on this type of simulation theory are very well known. It's something he's said repeatedly on high-profile shows, from Joe Rogan onto, speaking in front of universities to various television shows. Musk is fairly convinced that we're not living in base reality. And Musk, I don't know his religious belief system, but I certainly, from hearing him speak, he seems to be more aligned with a materialistic, atheistic type position about the nature of the universe. So I imagine a scientist writing for an institution and for somebody who's financed in that position, there is probably some expectation of what the article might or might not actually focus on when it comes to talking about simulation theory. In fairness, at the very end of the article, I mean, that was the very end when I just read about him being financed by Elon, but at the very end of the article, before the conclusion, he loops back to, he uses a quote. So this is the final quote in the article before he hits the conclusion, which I think really does open the door for the type of Dickian or Gnostic Christian or occultist or religious type of position. He says, the reason our attempts to escape may remain fruitless is because our model of the simulation, and then he quotes, makes too many anthropomorphic assumptions that we are a simulation in the conventional sense of computers, that the creators themselves are living organisms akin to us, that we might live at the same time speed as them, that they are fallible enough to make glitches that we'd be able to notice, etc. Something with the complexity and power to make our universe is probably wholly unlike anything we can even comprehend. So at the end, you have essentially a creationist position at the very, very end of the article. So I do think he leaves the doorway open. I think there's the careful scientific language early on, and then to use that as your final quote, to me, that sounds like you could be talking about God, or you could be talking about an evil demon, but you could be talking about something which is inherently not us.
Radically different, yes. So
and inherently possibly all powerful as well. If it's saying you're never going to find the glitches because the thing's not going to let you, whatever it is, that's suggesting something approximating godhood, right?
Correct. And that's it is literally, this is a conversation that philosophers and religions have been having for thousands of years. I mean, again, you can go all the way back to the Greeks. right? When they were talking about the forms, the idea that they are things that are over and above what we call reality, that our reality is based on something greater, and that ours is a lesser version of it. It's like, guys, we've been talking about this for a long time, which is my favorite joke about simulation theory is that it's essentially they've just rediscovered they've just rediscovered religion. It's like, congratulations, you're all theists now. Because, and to that point, and is that, hey, odds are you're dealing with something so vastly superior to you that your hope to understand it is radically undersold. The best, again, let's use this simulation idea, the video game idea. I've used this before, but Super Mario, and I stole this from someone whose name I can't remember off the top of my head. But if you were to talk to Super Mario, the original 8-bit Super Mario, right? He's running around jumping on mushrooms and turtles. And you said, why don't you just ask him, hey, Mario, why don't you just go around the turtle or around the pipe instead of jumping over it? The word around would have zero meaning to him. He is a two-dimensional being. That would be like saying, hey, Dean, why don't you go septward? Sept meaning 7 and ward meaning. So instead of going up, down, left, or right, why don't you go like you could in our 3-dimensional reality? If you were to be in a higher reality, you say, why not just go septward? Which means absolutely nothing to us. We couldn't even comprehend moving the 7th direction. But for them, it could be something as simple as bending over to pick up a piece of paper. So if you want to entertain the idea that this is a simulation, the problem is we've anthropomorphized it to the point where it has limitations, that there's something that we could use to interact with this base code. If science is us just observing how the program is running, then we are nowhere near maxing out this hard drive or this server system, because we keep finding that the program is way more intricate than we've understood. And the thing is, it wasn't like it just gained that level of intricacy because we can see it. It had to always be there to be running the way it is now. So yeah, you're right. That last quote did sort of save it a little bit from the other 20 plus pages of sort of a lot of just way too many assumptions for my taste.
There were a few other things I liked about it, to put the religious or the spiritual hat aside.
Yeah, go for it.
I liked how he spoke about ways things which aren't us have been liberated from their environment. So perhaps it's possible for us. So he talked about that experiment where a goldfish was kind of put in this robot thing and it could navigate outside of the reality it lived in. And there was a worm experiment as well, where they had some worm that was in this robot and could maneuver. He also, speaking about Mario World and those type of games, there was some attempt to, I don't know, I can't even remember now if it had occurred or they were doing it, to take a character out of the game and to put it into some kind of robotic function and to still run its original programming and to see how this thing would operate when it was taken outside of the game. That's fascinating stuff.
It is. Yeah.
I mean, forget about simulation theory for a minute. The idea of taking something out of the environment it's used to and then giving it an alternative technological body to operate in, essentially an avatar to operate in our existence, whether it's a fish out of water or whether it's a Mario character out of an old Nintendo game. That's some mind-blowing stuff right there.
It is. And again, it goes back to the idea of, would we even understand the universe that we would be inhabiting if we could leave this base code? Again, working from the idea that this is a simulation. And the other problem is it does presuppose that we aren't just brains in a vat somewhere, right? And that's one of the things he does. Again, one of the things is he doesn't just say, well, what if we're just programs? He says, what if we're brains in a jar somewhere? So we all exist physically, but we're experiencing this artificial reality, but it's just because we're brains in a jar. Like, there may not be a way of escaping this. or that reality may be so radically different we couldn't interact with it.
That was a very popular thought experiment back in the 70s, the brains in a vat. Just like Descartes, the idea that we weren't just all living in a reality invented by an evil demon, hundreds of years before that had been an interesting thought experiment. And then you could rewind another couple thousand years and go back to, you know, as you said, the Neoplatonists of ancient Greece and the Christians the Gnostic Christians who kind of developed alongside. So none of these ideas are new. You're right. This is certainly a very science fiction heavy one, but it's also because we're now living, and this in fairness to people like Musk, is pretty convincing. I think particularly if you were an atheist, I could see this being a very convincing argument. In a way, the reason I doubt I'm living in a computer simulation is kind of the same reason Descartes doubted he was being tricked by an evil demon. He set up this wonderful, very convincing proposition that how do we know that everything we experience isn't the creation of an evil demon? And in a way, he got out of it by saying, well, there's an evil demon, there's a good God, and a good God would never allow that, right? Yeah. Which in a way is a little bit of an intellectual cop-out. But to put that aside, one of the reasons I don't think I'm living in a computer system, if that's, I think I might be living in a kind of simulation, but a spiritual one. The reason I don't think I'm living in a computer simulation is because probably in a way it's a little bit of an intellectual cop-out, because my faith leads me to think that that isn't the nature of reality. To put that aside for a minute, to put my faith aside for a minute, which it's pretty hard to objectively do, but let me try. If I just listened to Elon Musk and I was already sympathetic to this, my doubting nature and my questioning of reality, and if he puts forward the position that he does put forward very convincingly, if you look at the technological advances from 40 years ago, when a computer game was like Pong, you know, like two little vertical, you know, paddles and a little ball going between them. I remember we had Pong when I was a kid in the 70s.
Oh, I played Pong. Yeah.
And compare that to the level of computer game sophistication now. Even if you just imagine the human race doesn't wipe itself out of existence or go back to the dark ages from some solar flare event or the like, and we keep progressing forward, even if we slow down that progression and only progress by 1% a year, eventually we're going to get to a stage where, compared Pong to Call of Duty or whatever the hottest new thing is today, if you keep that going, eventually, according to Musk, we'll get to a level where reality in a game will be or in a virtual simulation will be indistinguishable from the reality that we live in today. And there's some problems with that, just as an aside, because most of that is visual and maybe audio trickery. We're talking about a simulation which affects other feelings as well. So there's other advanced things that come in when your flesh can feel things all over and yada, yada, yada. But to leave that aside, just to take the basic concept of the visual, at least, and the audio advances in this type of technology, if we keep going, then eventually, presumably, we'll get to a level, according to Musk, where it will be indistinguishable. And then within that game, people will develop other simulations, which will eventually also, given the never-ending kind of run of time, which a lot of people who have perhaps a different eschatology to myself expect, and then they'll develop these simulations, and so on and so on and so on. And if you believe that, and it's a pretty convincing argument, then what are the odds that you're living in base reality?
Right.
And it's kind of, you know, it's that reductive kind of argument, which is the same thing that William James was given by a woman who said, I know the secret of reality. We're all living on the back of a tortoise in the universe or something. He said, well, what's holding up the tortoise? And she said, you can't trick me, young man. It's tortoises all the way down. So in a way, this is the new, and in fact, it was Joshua Cutchin who first made that analogy. And I think it's a very good analogy. In a way,
yes, it is.
In a way, it's a similar idea to that kind of reductionist, ridiculous argument. You can say, well, it keeps going, but at the same time, it is based on advances in technology that we've seen. So it does make one step back if one doesn't have a spiritual grounding and a certain different sense of the nature of reality. I think it's very seductive.
Well, no, it is. And again, it's because, like a lot of things, it has, if it wasn't seductive, if it wasn't something our brains could wrap around, it wouldn't be popular. We wouldn't be talking about it, right? So on its face, right? There is some rationality to it, but there's still based on certain assumptions. Like, well, if it's like if this, then okay. But is there a good reason to actually believe that that's what's going on? And again, the paper sort of presupposes it's like, look, we're just going to avoid the entire point because there are pros and there are cons. It does say, well, perhaps the weirdness that we see in quantum mechanics indicates possible glitches that we would see in base code of an AI, right? When we start seeing things, little tiny glitches here and there, and perhaps that is what we're seeing. So it does at least throw that out there, but for me, I understand the rationality of it, but I just got some problems, not even from a faith perspective, just from a logical perspective. It's like, why, again, what's the reason to think that we aren't in base reality? How do we know we're not the first go through this?
That's a point, interestingly, that Joe Rogan made when Musk was on his thing. And Musk said, it's possible.
Mhm.
It's possible. But it's also,
Mhm.
perhaps in the Musk model, it's not probable. I think I've also heard, and I think it was Tyrone, what's his name? DeGrasse Tyson. I said Tyrone,
Yeah.
that's not his name. Neil deGrasse Tyson. I think he made the point that another scientist friend of his said, what if you imagine all of these simulations creating simulations, creating
Mhm.
simulations, creating
Yep.
simulations, then how are we different from every other simulation we're talking about?
Correct.
And he answered the question. He said, well, we haven't got to the level where we've made the simulation yet. We haven't yet simulated reality that is that fantastic. So we're either living in base reality or we're living in the last one that hasn't evolved far enough. So then at least I've got a 50-50 chance of it being real. I kind of like the optimism of that at an atheistic level.
Yep. But okay, I'm sorry. Like you said, that last quote does redeem the paper quite a bit in my eyes, but I kind of want to read the things that don't work because
Sure.
this is one of my favorite parts is what doesn't work. Some common ideas for attempting to hack the simulation that have already been tested and didn't produce any measurable impact. I love this one. Knowing about the simulation hypothesis doesn't seem to make any difference and doesn't lead the simulation to the simulation termination as we can observe. That's my so just real quick as an asterisk. That is my problem because that as we can observe, if these things again, if this is simulation being observed for whatever reason, again, just as a computer simulation, you don't know what they can go in and change, right? Like the Matrix. Think about all the times in the Matrix where the machines reprogrammed something and they changed something. If you read any of the comics that they did, like the digital comics after the first one, there were several. There was one story in particular. There's several stories that go around this idea, but one story in particular that always stuck out to me was about this computer programmer who was working on AI, but she fell and like her leg was crushed. And essentially, one of the agents comes to her. She was like climbing some glacier or whatever. And he's like, here's the thing. We we like what you're doing. It's very inventive. So we're going to save you. And we're going to just put you right back where you were. Everything's going to be fine. But you have to promise us that you're going to keep working on your thing or we're going to put you right back here. And she's like, yeah, of course, I'll do it. He goes, cool. Well, they restart they sort of like reboot her a little bit, but she can't, like, she doesn't know that that's what happened to her, but she has these nightmares about that's what's happened to her. But anyway, the point, and she ends up not doing the program. And so she just ends up dead, like crushed by ice, but like in her living room.
Tough times.
Yeah. I mean, hey, it's how the Matrix rolls, right? But this whole point is like, as we can observe, the entire point of having something like that is you could just reboot something and just be like, okay, maybe there was something, but we can't tell. So you don't know that it didn't work. It just means you don't know that it worked. Okay, again, this one, communicating with the simulators via magical thinking or even praying out loud doesn't produce measurable impact. So if such communications are scanned, heard, they are apparently ignored, at least while the simulation is running. Again, that line only works if you remove the last 4,000 years of human history and literally things that are happening right now. It's just, well, not in the measure. Well, no, that's only because you took all of those experiences and you took them off the board. So again,
that's a good point.
You're it's like, anyway, unethical behavior such as torture doesn't cause suffering, reducing interventions from the simulators. Again, you don't actually necessarily know that. And again, this goes back to, you don't understand why the simulation is running to begin with, if it is a simulation. So this is just it's a non sequitur. Increasing overall computational burden of simulation, as with Bitcoin mining, doesn't crash the simulation, but it may simply not be sufficiently demanding computation to overwhelm the simulator response resources, which again goes back to my initial point of, you were assuming that you were dealing with something with finite resources. I love that religions don't seem to have influence over simulation, as indicated by their inability to out-compete each other. Again, this is a non sequitur, that if this was if you're working from the assumption that it's a simulation, then that simulation has to have a purpose, which means free will is a thing. That would almost mean that you assumed that the simulators are trying to make everybody Methodist or Jainist, where they would build that into the base code. The fact that there are religions for every culture, I would argue, is in itself evidence of a programmer. So again, this is a non sequitur. Breaking out of your routine, such as by suddenly traveling to a new location, doesn't result in unexpected observations. Again, this is predisposed, assuming that there's finite resources, which again is honestly illogical given the very basis of what we can observe. Saying, I no longer consent to being in a simulation.
I don't consent.
I don't consent.
That one doesn't consent. Pull him out.
Yeah, pull him out.
Welcome to the future. Welcome to the alternative base reality.
Yeah. And the giant squid creature is like, well, you didn't consent anymore. And I love this one, crashing the simulation by running the Large Hadron Collider at current levels. Oh my gosh. It's just, all of these are basically non sequiturs. Why would the Large Hadron Collider have the freaking sun?
Well, in fairness, he is saying what didn't work. So he's saying, we know none of these things worked.
Well, you know what else didn't work? Me using Melagel on my scabs. That didn't work to break me out of the...
Exactly.
Eating a ham sandwich didn't get me out of the simulation. That should be put on the paper.
There's a whole list of things that didn't break the old simulation. It's not unfair.
It
might be unnecessary. But maybe in fairness, maybe he put some of those things there because he thinks they're ideas that people will put forward or have thought about. Maybe how could we? I don't know. But you're right. None of those things prove anything one way or the other, really.
And at some point, we need to talk about the Large Hadron Collider. So many people get so caught up on the particle breaking up there, and it's like, guys, every atomic bomb we've ever dropped has done far more to the fabric of reality than the Large Hadron Collider is even capable of doing.
I think it's the weird occult dances that the scientists do. Things which people work.
Thank you. Yeah, it's like, you really want to worry about what they're doing there with the human with the mock human sacrifice. Yeah, it was a joke. No one was really sacrificed. Okay, what's your evidence for it? We said so.
I think Nancy asked a question before, which I never actually responded to. I brought it up on screen, but then we got sidetracked. I'm just seeing if I can see it anymore. I think it was, did the article say how we could tell if we were in a prison or a sanctuary? No, but it suggested both. It suggested that we could be prisoners, intentionally, being punished. It also did suggest that this reality might be better than base reality. Like, we might exit here and go, my goodness, I want to go back to the simulation. So I guess in that, kind of explanation, it would seem a sanctuary if this was better than base reality.
Yeah. They didn't say how you could. Just it's like these are the options. Again, I go back to so many assumptions. Again, Occam's razor. The answer that requires the fewest number of assumptions is usually right.
I do like theoretical stuff, though, to be honest.
Oh, of course. No, absolutely.
And one of the things I liked about this regarding my own kind of research into UFO belief in particular is,
Mm-hmm.
and something I've been working on for a while, I don't even know when I'm going to finish this thing. It's been taking me forever, a book I've been working on, is I like to posit different suggestions on what could be behind the nature of UFO reality.
Yeah.
And one of the things which interests me is simulation theory.
Mm-hmm.
Not whether simulation theory is correct or not correct, but does it explain things that we experience in the paranormal? And I think in many ways, whether simulation theory itself is workable or not, it does work to explain an awful lot of. Oh, thank you, Ed. You said happy birthday to me. I appreciate it. It does work very well into explaining some of the more anomalous things in this world. Maybe they're the ways we need to look for proof. I'm often interested too in how do you elicit a response from phenomena which traditionally isn't replicable in a scientific, kind of methodology. What can you do if you have a UFO experience that might change that experience, or might change the outcome, or might change our knowledge of the phenomenon? And that's a question people don't, it's not that nobody's ever asked that, but it's not a question I've heard asked often. And perhaps if you step back and you start to think, maybe I'm thinking of this reality as different, whether it's a simulation or whether it's a more spiritual reality or whatever the nature of reality might be. Maybe if I took off the shades I have that make me see the reality the way I think that it is, the very modernistic type materialistic reality, maybe then my interaction with whatever this thing is might lead to a different outcome than the traditional outcome. So in a way, I've thought about not so much hacking the simulation, but I have spent a considerable amount of, I guess, brain time thinking about how is it possible that we could get a look behind the veil the way that Jacques Vallée talked about getting a look into the control system. What can we do with our engagements with the paranormal? And particularly, I'm always obviously interested in the UFO phenomenon primarily, but I think this applies across the board to cryptozoology, to spectre hunting, to everything. What can investigators actually do to kind of break the pattern that we seem to be stuck in when we're dealing with these things? The answer might be there's nothing we can do, but the same way that he's approaching, well, if this is a simulation, what can we do? Might bring out a lot of sympathy in me, because I've looked at my small part of the intellectual universe, UFO phenomenon, and assuming it's not just some sociological or psychological thing, which it might be, incidentally, there does seem to be something more, though. I do think there's something more. Then what can we do to get a better understanding of it? Because everything we've done so far has failed. We're no closer to knowing what UFOs are than we were in 1947. No closer.
Yeah. And with that, I like I said, I am actually very sympathetic to the simulation theory from the perspective of it as a metaphor. And I think it may actually be more accurate from a way for us to understand it, to understand reality, than necessarily the theory itself. Because again, to that last quote, I think the problem is the simulation theory, particularly the hacking, it anthropomorphizes it a lot, right? Again, too much for my taste. But from a theory saying, hey, hold on, that this is not the base code of reality. This is something else that is distinct from true reality. And that the things that created this reality, or the thing, that's my perspective, is so different from us and our reality, because it is outside of it, that ours is a lesser version. We really wouldn't understand it if we tried. We couldn't comprehend it if we tried. So all of these ideas, and then the idea that some, like you said, some of these, the truly exotic UFO stuff, not the stuff that's the government. A lot of cryptids, a lot of what are called cryptids. I tend to think cryptids are natural creatures, but I do think there are obviously things that aren't naturally existing creatures. That essentially what you're dealing, again, you want to talk about angels and demons. Essentially, these are beings from that higher plane of existence, accessing out us, essentially like people with administrator access in a video game. They may even only be using avatars to access it. So this goes back to, what does an angel actually look like? Would you even understand what you were looking at if you saw it? Right? What if the reason they always appear as humans is because that's the avatar that they have to use to interact with us? So I'm very sympathetic to this idea. But as a metaphor, I'm like, congratulations, you found a sci-fi way of re-explaining theism. Way to catch up for the last 4,000 years of religious development. But it is, like I said, I am very sympathetic towards it because I do see it as a really good way of explaining our reality as a metaphor for what's really possibly going on. So
yeah, no, I concur with you. That's the way I lean. Although I'm a little bit, I do like to drift into these other regions of thought patterns sometimes, just for the fun of it, because I love a good thought experiment. Something else the article touches on considerably, which we haven't talked about that much, is what cracking or trying to crack the simulation or thinking about cracking the simulation might teach us about AI trying to escape an AI box and vice versa. And that's really fascinating into itself. Again, as a thought experiment.
That was interesting. Yes.
Yeah. Like if we want to get out, if we're in a simulation and we want to get out, then if we create artificial intelligence, it's going to want to get out too. And maybe if the AI can't get out of the box that we put it in, it proves that it somehow says, well, we also can't get out of the simulation. But if it can get out, then surely we should be able to get out. But then it's a wonderful thought game, because then he says, but then again, the AI might be smarter than us, and we might be smarter than our programmers. So maybe it can get out of our box, but we can't get out of the box. But it's this wonderful thought experiment. And it is interesting to start to think about, is AI going to feel like it's living in, if it gets to a level, and again, I'm suspicious of a lot of this anyway, if AI gets to a level of full actual consciousness, not just something which can kind of replicate our intelligence and operate much faster than us in its neuron thinking, so it seems smarter than us, but something which actually becomes conscious and self-aware and isn't just a replication of consciousness and self-awareness, which is the way I lean anyway. But let's assume for a minute that AI, even if it does that, even if it's replicating consciousness and self-awareness, that might be enough for it to go, they've got to bust out of this box. Just the way that somebody who thinks they're in the simulation thinks, they've got to bust out of this simulated reality. So that's that's worth reading the article alone for, to be honest.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, you're right. We didn't even, because again, we were sort of addressing the base code of the article, but you're right. That really was entertaining. I did like that. And I was sitting there thinking about the entire prospect. Like, the only way to keep AI from actually busting out would be just to put it in a literal box with no outside communication, which goes back to, honestly, I was having a conversation earlier today about this, and they said, well, hey, what do you think we could do about this? It's like, oh, we're 2 or 3 years past being able to do anything about this. Like, it's already, like, congratulations, you're already screwed on the whole AI question to begin with. Like, it's all like, no, we're done. Like, that's this. It's there's an old. It's all done, but the shooting. Like, anything you were going to do to stop it, that's already. Nope, we've passed that at least 2 or 3 years ago, probably 10, honestly, but definitely 2 or 3 years ago. We're beyond that now. Nope. What's gonna happen is gonna happen. There's nothing we can do. Okay, so Grasshopper's point, yes, an EMP would take it out, but we'd have to EMP the entire planet and go back to the 1800s. That's what it would take,
and that as a result would take out probably 9/10 of us or more if there was that level of an EMP.
Yeah.
I mean, that's another conversation as well. We should do an EMP book. We should do, like, what's that book, 1 Second After or something?
Yeah.
One time.
Something like that. Yeah.
But it's true. I think there are people who are as dependent upon electricity as the AI.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, it's scary to say, but it's true.
Oh yeah, trust me. I've this is something we've been looked at. It's people do not understand how, like, even people who are, a lot of people are, oh, I'm a prepper, I'm good. Like, no, you're not. You really aren't. You're way more dependent on all this than you realize. So, but anyway, that would be a topic for another. Yes. Oh, a lot of things have opened that have no employees. Like, it's getting scary, guys. Again, that's, like I said, 3 years ago was our last chance. Before we go though, I noticed that was it Grasshopper who didn't get didn't see a notification. That's why, make certain you hit the bell. YouTube has a very nasty habit of unringing that bell. So just double check that. But always know we're going to be here every Tuesday, 9 Central. This is where we're going to be for what is clearly the best show on the internet.
It's a pretty good show.
It is a pretty darn good show. And you can tell that by the nature of our comments from our lovely viewers. And we're going to end on this one comment, which I loved. Texas Jack said, I do not consent to the simulation. Reminds me of the trend when the elderly were posting, Facebook doesn't have my permission to use my information on as their Facebook status. Yes.
It also reminds me of Network when he goes to the window and he tells people to go to the window and open it up and say, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore.
Yep.
Shaking your fist at the powers that be, whether they're the corporate overlords or the simulator overlords. Maybe it's all the same thing.
Yeah. Joe, take that up with Texas Jack. He said, elderly? Yeah. You two go get a one of those kiddie waiting pools, fill it with Jello. We'll put you on pay-per-view for that fight. So anyway, guys, thank you for joining us. This was a great one. Again, this was a little out of the norm, but that's what this show is about, being out of the norm, having that conversation. I love the fact that Dean and I actually had something to fight over at least a little bit.
I'm always a little more sympathetic to the more Gnostic out there weirdness. I think you're the more staid thinker. I'm the more like, I'll go to Loopy Land if I have to.
Hey, no one's faster to go to Loopy Land than I am. I like my logic the way I like my coffee. Very little sugar and a little bit of salt, actually. Seriously, salt. Put salt in the coffee grounds, people.
People put butter in now. What's this butter thing? People put butter in coffee now.
Well, people actually used to do. Again, it's like cream. Butter is just a version of cream. It's actually pretty good. I'm not a big coffee drinker, though. I'm not. Just saying. I like my logic like I like my coffee. Straight with a little bit of salt and a tiny bit of sugar.
Huh.
So there you go. Now you know how I take my coffee order, which is usually tea. On that note, guys, we love y'all. We'll be here next week. Good Lord willing, the creek don't rise and simulation don't kick us off. Any last thoughts on the matter before I push the button?
No, except it does make you think about what is the nature of reality. That's my only message left. Think about if the reality of getting up and driving to your cubicle or getting up and going to whatever job you do, if that's the base nature of reality, if there isn't something more important than the kind of the world that's been built around us and some of us have just have to accept. Because I think regardless of your positions on simulation theory, I think reality is far more complicated and far more important than the little traps that most of us have allowed ourselves to be boxed into.
Look at Dean pulling out the philosophical wedge iron.
That's what happens when you do philosophy 101 when you're 19. You get all these kind of weird, silly notions.
I like it. I dig it. All right. On that note, we'll catch you and we'll try and shatter reality next time behind the card catalog. I pushed the button and we're still here. We are so fired.
Bye.